And he did have friends who were doctors, and he, I guess to the people that he felt comfortable with, good doctor friends, he did mention the fact that they were doing this research, right? So what was his scientific grasp? Okay, well, if there is life after death, if we as individuals continue to live, if our conscience continues to exist after we die, how can we prove it? Okay. Again, being a man of science, he and this is straight out of his book. He says, well, scientific exploration begins by forming a hypothesis and then gathering evidence that will support it or false. That's how scientific practices come to be, right? So the hypothesis, is there life after death? Do we still live after we die? Okay, now we have to gather evidence to either support it or to say no. Okay? So, he said, physics teaches us that it's scientifically appropriate to infer the existence of invisible process through careful observation in the repeated experiments. For example, just to translate this into everyday language, the law of gravity, okay? Newton inferred that there is gravity because if you throw something from the air, it falls. There's a force that pulls it, right? That's how he could prove it. Because Newton was much more intelligent than I am, and mathematically he came up with beautiful formulas to prove all this, gravitational laws and all that. But basically, when it comes to people like us, that's what it translates to. So in science or in physics, they infer the existence of invisible forces, okay, just by observing the repeated experiments of dropping whatever, or the fact that we can stand up and we don't fall because we're being pulled by the gravitational force of the Earth. Same with the planets, okay. And later then we have what? Radio waves, microwaves. We don't see them. We don't see gravity. But we can infer the existence just by observing. And magnetic fields, and you name it. There's so many more things now in science that science has discovered that falls into exactly this, observing the repeated experiments. So that's what they wanted to get, right? So the hypothesis was, right, so they had to form a hypothesis to be able to prove it. That one can scientifically infer the existence of invisible living info energy systems, living souls and spirits, through systematic and careful experimentation. Makes sense, right? So now you see that how his thinking is happening, and he, through this book, he takes you all through that, scientific language. But basically, this is what we're going to try to prove by observing and careful observation in the repeated experiments. Right? So how are they going to do that? Okay, well, we're trying to do everything in the hush-hush. And he was traveling one day and he gets home and he gets a letter from a doctor friend of his, a psychiatrist, who kind of knew what he was doing, and sent him a clipping of a newspaper about this woman called Susie Smith. This was the year of 1995. Susie Smith was a medium. She was at the time 85 years old. Okay, she had been talking, let's say, communicating with her mom, who had died like 40 years before, all the time. And so the newspaper clipping just talked about her and what she was doing. She had published a bunch of books already, and some of the books were channeled. And he started thinking, and this woman was a journalist. She was, a regular citizen. And so he decided to contact her. And he contacts her and he tells his Linda, because they were in different parts of the country at that point, about this woman. And he tells her, well, maybe we should talk to her and see if we can find out anything for our research. Okay? So eventually they get in touch with Susie, and they invite Susie over for dinner. And talk to her over dinner, and they find out this information about her. And she talks to them about her communicates regularly with her mother, also with this man called William James, Professor James. And he's taken back. And she goes, he's actually my mentor. This Professor James, and as soon as she said Professor William James, the Dr. Schwartz kind of like, the antenna goes up. This Professor James had been a professor at Harvard in the 19th century, a doctor that, he was a medical doctor, but eventually went into the field of psychology, and was very much like in the 19th century, a little bit past Kardec's years, but it's still in the 19th century. He worked with a lot of mediums and start proving the existence or the living consciousness that continues after we die. So he was like, oh, that's quite interesting. He said, I actually went to when he was studying Harvard doing his PhD, most of the time he spent was actually in the building called Professor William James. And he's thinking, oh, this is amazing. Like, he was totally excited about this William James professor, right? So, he gets the information and they get everything and they send her off in her merry way, and he kind of starts thinking about it, continues with his research, and leaves things. And then in the fall of 1997, he gets a letter or a phone call from another doctor friend of his who talks about this medium, Laurie Campbell, another unknown person. And he said, I went to her because my son passed away, and I heard that she was a medium, so I just kind of went, and I got a lot of information that was pretty spooky. So he said, why don't you talk to her? Okay, again, and this one was somewhere else in the country. So he contacted the woman, Laurie Campbell, and eventually when they were face to face, and he went to talk to her, something quite interesting happened. He wanted to kind of see what he would find out. So he gets there, and she says to him, and they got talking on that, and she says, I'm perceiving the presence of your mother. He goes, okay, well, tell me what she's like. So she goes on describing his mother, and he's already thinking, pretty good. And then she talks about his father. And he thinks, okay, well, yeah, maybe she could have found that information very easily. She could have asked people, she knew we're meeting, she knew who I am. She could have asked people about my history. I mean, that's not hard to find out who my mother was, who my father was, right? So he said, can you contact a man by the name of William James? Now, this is a regular person who had, up to high school, I myself had never heard of Professor William James until I read the book. I had no idea who he was. So, she does. She goes into a trance. And she starts giving this whole spiel. And this is what he says. The man, William James, began to lecture about the psychology of consciousness, the importance of doing research on the afterlife, and the need to integrate science and spirituality. For almost 15 minutes, this simple woman with little advanced education delivered a polished lecture on philosophy and soul science. At this point, the guy is like, whoa, there is something here, right? I'm onto something good here, right? So he thinks, all right, then how could this woman, and he also mentioned in the book how she changed. Her tone of voice, her way of speaking changed from when she was talking as his father, as his mother, and now as his 19th century professor. And she said there's no way she would give him that lecture, just like that, off the blue like that. She wouldn't have even known that stuff. Survival of conscience of the soul and all that. So he said, okay, I'm going to do one last check. And he said, can you contact Dr. Henry Ruzek? He was the father of Linda Ruzek, his partner, who lived somewhere else. She was in Florida. They are now in Arizona. Okay? And so she tries. And she gets a message that says something like, he says, I've been waiting for years to communicate with my daughter. I've been following your research with my daughter. And he says, and tell her, thank you for the music. He says, what is that? So he gets on the phone right away, like the woman's still there. And he calls Linda. And he goes, okay, this is what I heard. This woman doesn't know who Dr. or I didn't say doctor, I said Henry Music, that's your dad. And she said, to tell you, thank you for the music. Well, it just so happened that when Linda's father was very ill in the hospital, he had I think, cardiac arrest and some other health problems. He was in the intensive care unit for a few weeks. The doctors thought he was unconscious, so he wasn't talking or anything. They think there was nothing else there going on. She got a special speaker pillow. This is his daughter had got a special speaker pillow. Had get some specially recorded music for that, and she played that music for him the whole time he was in the hospital through his pillow speaker. Even though the doctors were saying he's not there, like he's just in the coma, there's nothing there, but she wanted to do that. She loved her dad dearly. And all of a sudden she hears, thank you for the music. He describes Linda on the other side of the phone, just sitting on, just falling on the sofa and thinking, this can't be. It is my father, for sure, right? So she played, actually I have it here, she played that specially recorded music for him during his last 5 weeks of life. The only person who knew was her mother, and the person who actually recorded the music for her, and some nurses in the hospital. No one else knew about this. How would this woman know? This woman wouldn't even know who Henry Music is, the father, right? So again, they figured this is something worthwhile. Let's continue. So, there's the thank you for the music. More scientific research happens, they keep going. And here's then they decide, let's do some more experiments. We want more tangible data. So, they tried to do an experiment with the two now. Susie Smith, the first 85-year-old woman, and Lori Campbell. They bring them to the same town, and they come up with an idea for an experiment. And it was a picture experiment, and this is how the experiment went. Lori Smith was in her, actually Lori Smith did live in Tucson, Arizona, so they were in Tucson at this point. The other lady lived some other state, so she was flown in. Lori Smith was in her apartment, and she would, her job at that point was to contact four deceased people. One being her mother, whom she communicated with all the time. One being Professor William James, her guide. One being Dr. Schwartz's father, and one being Dr. Linda's father. So Dr. Henry, and then Dr. Schwartz's father, I forget his name, and those other two people. And from them, she was to get some idea of something to draw on a picture. Okay. Then she was going to, for a control picture, draw another picture herself. Just her own picture. So she had 5 pictures. She put them in a sealed envelope. When an envelope sealed it, okay, and then Dr. Schwartz, okay, with the other medium, Lori Campbell, in the apartment, okay. Lori Campbell was then to try to contact the same spirits and get information that would help them figure out who drew, or which picture was for which person. So he had cameras going, he had a tape recorder, he was making notes, okay, and he took notes, and that was that. Then they brought in Susie, who met Lori at that point. Now it was the first time they met, the two mediums. And they decided, okay, let's open the envelope, take out the pictures. So there was